Rain hit the rooftop like the sky itself was grieving, but inside the Bennett mansion, no one seemed to care about anything but tradition, image, and control. Emily Bennett sat stiffly at the edge of the cream velvet sofa, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. 19 years old, barely done with college prep, and yet her life had already been signed away. She was being married off, like property, because her parents said it was for her own good. Correction. Not her real parents. She had always known something didn't feel right. Her mother, Victoria Bennett, was never one for hugs. Her father, Charles Bennett, barely acknowledged her except when guests were around. And then there was her golden-haired sister, Clarissa, perfect, blood-bound, and cold as frost. Everything changed the week Emily turned 18. A whisper from a furious Clarissa in the hallway, "You should be grateful they took you in. We saved you." A slip, an opening. Emily followed that crack until the truth poured out. She was adopted, a baby left at an orphanage, plucked into the Bennett home for reasons still unclear, and now they were done with her. "You'll marry him," Victoria had said, pouring tea like she wasn't handing down a life sentence. "He's humble, grateful, a poor man but kind, suitable for someone like you, someone like her." That was the phrase they kept using, like it was a curse. Her fiancé was a man named Elias. Supposedly worked odd jobs, landscaping, construction, some handyman work, lived on the edge of town in a broken-down cabin. The Bennetts wanted to be rid of Emily, but they didn't want her marrying anyone who'd ever have power, influence, or a name. They wanted her forgotten, buried under shame. But Emily wasn't weak, not anymore. The day of the engagement, she stood in front of a small gathering, just family and a few select guests, and saw him for the first time. Elias stood quietly in the corner, not speaking much, tall, broad shoulders, tanned skin from sun work, eyes like thunderclouds, and the moment their gazes met, something shifted. He didn't look at her like she was a burden. He looked at her like she was fire. "Nice to meet you," he said, voice low, calm. "I've heard plenty." Her eyes narrowed. "I'm sure you have." Behind them, Victoria sipped wine, looking smug. Later that night, Emily was crying alone on the balcony, not because of the marriage, but because of the betrayal. She had given everything to a family that never truly wanted her. She had built her entire identity around their approval, and now, tossed out like garbage. Then Elias showed up behind her, footsteps, silent. "You're not garbage," he said, like he could read her mind. "They treat you like it, but that's not who you are." She spun, startled. "What are you doing here?" "I don't like people crying alone." "You don't know me." "Maybe not, but I know what it's like to be underestimated." He smiled, and there was something strange in it. Not pity, not smugness, confidence, like he was holding onto a secret. "You really live in a shack?" she asked. He shrugged. "Sometimes." She blinked. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer and looked her in the eye. "Let them marry you off to me," he said. "Let them think they've won." "Why?" she whispered. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "the poor man they force on you isn't so poor after all." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her confused, curious, and for the first time in weeks, slightly hopeful. But she had no idea just how deep his secret went. And neither did the Bennetts. The wedding was set in 3 weeks, rushed, quiet, and deliberately stripped of glamour. Victoria claimed it was to avoid unnecessary attention, but Emily knew better. They didn't want anyone asking why their adopted daughter was marrying a man who couldn't afford a tuxedo. Elias didn't say much in those weeks. He showed up when required, spoke politely, even helped fix a broken gate at the Bennett estate, when the staff refused to touch it. Emily watched him from afar, puzzled. He didn't behave like someone desperate. There was no begging, no fawning, no attempt to win her over. In fact, he acted like he didn't need anything from them at all. One night Emily slipped away from the house. She couldn't sleep, and something about Elias gnawed at her. She found herself walking toward the edge of town, toward the address he supposedly lived at. It was nearly midnight, the wind sharp, the road lit only by amber street lamps. Then she saw it. The old cabin. Run down, sure. Paint chipped, fence leaning, but there was something wrong about it. It was too perfect in its imperfection, like someone had designed it to look broken. Emily hesitated, then knocked. Elias answered in a plain grey t-shirt and sweatpants, holding a mug of coffee like he wasn't at all surprised to see her. "You came," he said simply. She stared at him. "This is a setup." He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "This place," she said, stepping inside. "It looks poor, too poor, like you're playing a role." He didn't deny it. He just closed the door behind her and leaned against the wall. "So? Why pretend?" He sipped the coffee slowly. "Because people show their real face when they think you're nothing." Emily narrowed her eyes. "Are you testing me?" "No," he said softly. "Them." There was a long silence between them, heavy with something unsaid. Then she spotted it. A leather-bound file on the table, half covered by a jacket. Curiosity that tugged at her. She stepped closer, and Elias didn't stop her. She pulled it open and her heart stopped. Inside were documents, real ones, property deeds, company shares, overseas investments, confidential reports, and at the top of the pile, a business card. "Elias Ward, CEO, Ward Global Holdings." She turned slowly, breath caught in her throat. "You're a billionaire?" He met her eyes. "I inherited everything when I was 25. I've kept it quiet for years." "But why? Why let them think you're poor?" He walked over, took the card gently from her fingers. "Because people like the Bennetts. They only respect wealth. They use it like a weapon. I wanted to see how they'd treat someone who had none." Emily sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed. "They tried to bury me with this marriage." "I know," Elias said, "and that's exactly why I accepted it." She looked up at him sharply. "So this is revenge?" He shook his head. "No, this is a lesson, for them, and for you." "Me?" "You don't know your worth, Emily. They made sure of that. But I see it." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why, me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched in front of her, eyes level with hers. "Because I've been watching the Bennetts for a long time, and I knew the girl they raised like a shadow would be the only real thing in that house full of liars." She couldn't breathe. "You could have said something," she whispered, "told me the truth." "I could have, but you had to. Choose me without knowing it. Just once I wanted to be chosen for nothing but who I am." Emily felt the ground shift beneath her again. Everything she thought she knew had twisted, flipped, and the wedding. It was no longer a punishment. It was a storm about to crash into the lives of people who had played God with hers. The morning of the wedding was unusually calm, almost eerie. The sky was overcast, but there was no rain, just thick clouds, waiting. The Bennetts had rented out a small countryside chapel for the ceremony. Modest, dull, intentional. They didn't want headlines, didn't want questions. This was their little dirty secret wrapped up in lace and shoved out the back door. Emily stood in front of the mirror, staring at the simple satin dress they'd chosen for her. No designer label, no sparkles, just plain, like her presence was something to be tolerated, not celebrated. Victoria walked in without knocking. Her expression was tight, eyes scanning Emily like she was checking inventory. "You look clean," she said finally. "That's enough." Emily didn't respond, not a single word. "You'll say the vows, smile for the photos, and after this you'll be his problem, understood?" Emily turned slowly. Her voice was even. "I understand perfectly." Victoria smirked, turned on her heel and left, never noticing the little half-smile creeping up Emily's face once her back was turned, because Emily knew something they didn't, and in just a few hours, so would they. The chapel filled up with close family, business partners, and a handful of suspicious-looking friends. Charles Bennett shook hands like a senator, pretending his daughter's wedding to a poor handyman was a gesture of noble humility. Clarissa rolled her eyes the entire time, whispering insults under her breath to her boyfriend in the second row. But when Elias walked in, something shifted. He wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, not flashy, but fitted like it was meant, for power. His jaw was clean-shaven, hair styled back, and his eyes calm, cold, and watching everything. People turned. He didn't look poor. He looked dangerous. Clarissa leaned toward her mother. "That suit isn't cheap." Victoria's lips thinned. "Probably borrowed." But Elias didn't even look at them. He just stood near the altar, hands clasped calmly, waiting. And then the music began. Emily walked in slowly, veil down, but her steps didn't falter. She didn't look ashamed or afraid. She looked like she was walking into a war she was about to win. When she reached the front, she met Elias's eyes. He gave her the tiniest nod. She nodded back. The priest spoke, droning on about love, duty, sacrifice. Emily barely heard a word. Her heart thudded hard, but not with fear, with anticipation. And then, if anyone has reason why these two should not be wed, silence. Dead silence. Victoria's smirk grew slightly. "Then I now pronounce, actually." Elias's voice cut through the chapel like a blade. The priest froze. Everyone turned. Elias reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a silver case. From it he took a card. Then he walked calmly toward Charles Bennett. "I thought you might want to know who your new son-in-law really is." He handed the card to Charles. Confused, the old man squinted at it. Then, his face began to pale. Victoria snatched it, read it, froze. Clarissa leaned over, grabbed the card, and gasped. The room erupted in whispers. "Ward Global? As in, the Ward Global? He's their CEO? He's a billionaire?" Emily stepped forward now, lifting her veil. "I wasn't the shameful secret," she said clearly. "You were." Victoria stumbled back like she'd been slapped. "You let your pride blind you," Elias added. "You threw her away because she wasn't blood, but she's worth more than all of you combined." Emily turned to the crowd. "This marriage wasn't to hide me, it was to reveal you." The priest just stood there, stunned, holding the book open mid-sentence. Clarissa's mouth hung open. Charles sat down slowly, as if his knees gave out. And Victoria. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. A poor man turned billionaire. A girl she discarded, now glowing like gold. No one applauded. No one spoke. The silence was more powerful than 1,000 cheers. Because in that moment, the Bennetts weren't in control anymore. Emily was, and she hadn't just gotten married. She'd just taken back everything they stole from her. The reception was cancelled. Victoria stormed out of the chapel first, face pale, hands shaking. She didn't say a word. Charles followed, quieter, like a man walking to his own funeral. Clarissa, she was too stunned to throw one of her usual tantrums. She just stared at Emily like she was seeing her for the first time, and hated what she saw. Only Elias and Emily stayed behind, just married, just victorious. He helped her into the black car waiting outside. A sleek, custom vehicle with tinted windows and silence inside. The kind of car that screamed money without making a sound. She leaned back against the seat, heart pounding, still processing everything. Elias watched her closely. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. "More than okay. That felt better than I expected." A ghost of a smile pulled at his lips. "Told you, let them think they've won. Then show them who you are." She turned toward him. "What happens now?" He looked ahead, voice steady. "Now, we build. Your name. Your power. Your future." Emily blinked. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into the console and pulled out a sleek folder. Inside, documents again. But this time, her name was at the top. Emily Bennett Ward, Executive. Director, Ward Foundation. "You're putting me in charge of a foundation?" she whispered, stunned. "I'm giving you something they never did," he said. "Real power, real control. You're not just my wife, Emily. You're about to become a name people fear." Her throat tightened. No one had ever done this for her. Not out of pity. Not for gain. Just Because he believed in her. And maybe, just maybe, he saw her for who she truly was. 3 days later, the media got wind of the wedding. At first, they thought it was fake news. Elias Ward marrying a nobody, a girl from a dusty town in a forgotten family. But then the press releases dropped. The photos leaked. The wedding license appeared in city records. Suddenly, Emily was everywhere. Headlines: billionaire CEO marries adopted daughter of former senator. Bennett's refused to comment. Who is Emily Ward? From disgraced heiress to billionaire's bride. The Bennetts went silent. Victoria pulled back from public life. Charles cancelled 2 political fundraisers. Clarissa's fashion blog vanished overnight. Emily, on the other hand, she started attending charity events, giving interviews, standing next to Elias in black tie galas and shocking the elite with her grace, fire, and unapologetic honesty. Every time someone asked about the Bennetts, she smiled and said, "I was raised in a house that never saw me. Now I'm building homes for people who need more than just a roof." The public adored her, but the Bennetts, they were boiling. It started with a letter, hand-delivered, embossed, cold, from Victoria. "Emily, we need to talk. V. Bennett." She crumpled it without reading the rest. Then came Clarissa, showing up at a gala with crocodile tears, claiming she missed her sister. Elias watched it all from the side, letting Emily decide how to play it. She never flinched. But one night, alone on the balcony of their penthouse overlooking the city, she finally said it out loud. "They never loved me, not once. They just tolerated me like I was a stray." Elias stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "They don't know what to do with someone who rose without their permission." She leaned back against him. "Do you ever regret it, marrying me to destroy them?" "Destroy?" His voice was low, honest. "I didn't marry you to destroy them. I married you because you already survived them." That was the first night she let herself believe it. Maybe he didn't just see her as a pawn. Maybe he really loved her. But even love has shadows, and not everyone in the Bennett family was done playing. Because some grudges don't die, some go quiet, waiting, watching, planning. Emily never went back to the Bennett estate, not once. It became her personal rule, no looking back, no giving them a chance to rewrite the narrative. But that didn't stop them from trying. First, it was whispers in high society. Then it turned into attacks in business, a sudden lawsuit against... The Ward Foundation popped up, alleging fraud. False, of course, manufactured, but messy enough to hit the news cycle. Then someone leaked a story about Emily's adoption, twisting it into a sob tale meant to humiliate her. "From orphanage to billionaire's bed," the headline sneered. And through it all, Elias stayed quiet, watching, collecting. But Emily, she started to learn how to fight back. The media tried to paint her as a gold digger, so she gave a brutal, clear-eyed interview to a major network, sitting across from a veteran journalist. "I didn't marry Elias for his money. I married him because for the first time in my life, someone didn't ask where I came from. They asked what I wanted to become." That one line destroyed every rumor. But the Bennetts weren't finished. Not yet. Clarissa was the first to snap. She stormed into the Ward corporate offices one afternoon like she still mattered. Security tried to stop her, but Elias told them to let her through. He knew what this was. Desperation. Clarissa marched into the boardroom where Emily was reviewing projects with a team of investors. "You really think this makes you better than us?" she snapped, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. Emily didn't flinch. "I don't think about you at all." The room froze. Clarissa laughed bitterly. "You think Elias married you because you're special? You think a man like that doesn't have a reason?" "I know his reason," Emily said calmly. "He believes in what I'm building. Something real. Something you'll never understand." Clarissa stepped closer, lowered her voice. "They're going to ruin you. My father has already spoken to people, government people." Emily leaned forward, face inches from hers. "Let them try." Clarissa's confidence cracked for just a second. Then she spat, "You'll never be one of us." Emily smiled. "I don't want to be." And with that, Clarissa turned and walked out. because for the first time in her life she had no power in the room. That night Elias came home late. Emily was on the couch, files scattered, her hair tied in a messy knot. He dropped a flash drive onto the table. "What's this?" she asked. "Everything your father has been hiding." She blinked. "You mean—" Elias nodded. "Bribes, backdoor deals, illegal campaign donations, offshore accounts." She stared at the little drive like it was a nuclear weapon. "How?" "I've had a private team tracking him for months, ever since he signed off on this wedding. I knew men like him don't give away daughters for free unless they're covering something up." Emily looked up slowly. "You were planning this even before we met?" "I was planning justice," he said simply. "But then I met you, and it became personal." She swallowed hard. "What do we do with this?" "That's your call," Elias said. "I didn't dig it up for revenge. I did it so you could choose." Emily held the flash drive tightly in her hand. It was heavy, not in weight, but in power. The power to end the Bennets, to burn them to ash. Or walk away and rise without them ever knowing how close they came to destruction. The choice was hers. But across the city, in a cold office filled with old secrets, Charles Bennet was making a call of his own. He had one more card to play. And this time, it wouldn't be legal. It started with the phone call. Late, unknown number. Elias was in a meeting overseas, and Emily was alone in the penthouse, sorting through Foundation updates. She picked up out of instinct. No voice. Just breathing. She almost hung up until a voice finally spoke. "Be careful who you trust, Emily. Not every secret was meant to be uncovered." Click. Her blood ran cold. She checked the security cams. Everything looked normal. She double-checked the door locks. Armed. But the unease settled into her chest. Like smoke. She didn't call Elias, not yet. She didn't want him distracted. She told herself it was just a scare tactic, some old contact of Charles trying to intimidate her. They were cornered now. Of course they'd lash out. But then the photos arrived, delivered in a plain envelope. No name, just slid under the front. Door, inside, grainy surveillance shots of her. At the office, at a cafe, on the street. Someone had been following her, watching her. And then the note inside, "Turn over the drive or you'll end up as disposable as you began." Her hands trembled, but her eyes burned with rage. They were trying to break her. They didn't understand. They already had their chance to destroy her. Years ago, when she was a quiet, soft-hearted girl desperate for a family. But that girl didn't exist anymore. She called Elias, told him everything, sent him pictures of the letter, the envelope, the surveillance shots. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said only one thing. "I'm coming home tonight. Keep that drive hidden. Don't trust anyone." Elias touched down at midnight. His team was already mobilized. Security was doubled. The penthouse was swept for bugs, and every Bennet associate was put under surveillance. And then, finally, Elias turned to Emily. "Charles won't stop. He's been powerful too long. Losing control of you shattered his image." Emily nodded slowly. "I'm not afraid of him." Elias looked at her with something raw in his eyes. "You should be. Not because he's strong, but because he's desperate. Desperate men aren't predictable." She reached for his hand. "Then let's finish it." Elias studied her for a long second. Then he slid a second flash drive across the table. "This one has something else." She frowned. "What?" "A contract. The one that proves you were adopted not out of charity, but because Victoria owed a favor to someone powerful. A silent debt she never repaid." Emily's breath hitched. "So I was a transaction?" He nodded once. "You weren't supposed to find out. And once the favor was done, they locked you away in their house like a scar they couldn't hide." She stared at the drive. "Why are you showing me this now?" Elias leaned in. "Because when we take them down, it's not just about business. It's about the truth." Emily's hands curled into fists. She had spent years thinking she was the lucky one, the rescued girl, the chosen one. But she was a debt paid in flesh. And now that debt was coming due. 2 days later, Emily walked into a press conference. Alone. No Elias, no handlers. She faced a room full of cameras, journalists, and flashing lights, and she told her story. All of it. The fake adoption, the emotional neglect, the forced marriage, the lies, the manipulation, and then she dropped the name. Charles Bennett. Gasps, followed by silence. "I loved the family that never loved me back," she said, "but now I know the truth. I wasn't saved. I was purchased." Cameras clicked wildly. Reporters screamed questions. And across town, Charles Bennett sat in his office staring at the television, frozen. Then the FBI knocked on his door. He wasn't ready, but she was. Charles Bennett was arrested quietly. White collar, high class, no handcuffs, just a polite, "come with us." But the press was relentless. Cameras followed the motorcade. News anchors dug through every public record. The scandal exploded. Embezzlement, tax evasion, money laundering through shell charities. Everything Elias had uncovered, everything, was now public knowledge. Emily didn't celebrate. She knew it wasn't over. Victoria vanished first. No statements, no press appearances, no messages. She slipped into silence like a ghost. But people like her don't disappear without purpose. She was somewhere, waiting, plotting. Elias increased security. But the next blow didn't come from the outside. It came from inside the house. Emily woke one night to find her laptop missing. She hadn't used it in days. It was the old one she kept in her personal study. But now it was gone. No sign of forced entry, no footage on the cameras, just missing. She told Elias. His jaw tightened instantly. That laptop had access to Foundation archives, personal logs. "Nothing critical," Emily interrupted, trying to calm herself. "Just notes, my writings." But deep down she was already dreading it. The next morning it began. A blog appeared under her name, her face, her voice. But the words weren't hers. It claimed she'd married Elias for money, that she had plotted to destroy the Bennetts, that Elias had abused her, that she'd faked everything. A full-blown digital assassination. The media pounced. Emily Ward trended worldwide. Some praised her bravery, others demanded answers. People questioned the truth. Rumors spiraled like vultures. Elias called an emergency team meeting. PR, legal, digital forensics. But it was Emily who stood in front of the room and said, "Let them doubt me, let them rip me apart." The room fell quiet. Elias stepped forward. "Emily, no," she said, fire in her voice. "I want them to, because when the truth hits, it'll crush every lie they threw at me." It didn't take long to trace the hack. An IP address, hidden behind 3 proxies, a coffee shop Wi-Fi in another city. But it was Clarissa's boyfriend who slipped up. He bragged, texted someone about the story drop. Didn't realize the person he messaged was already on Ward Security's watch list. And just like that, Clarissa Bennett was exposed, the woman who smeared her own adopted sister to save her sinking name. When the press confronted her, she cracked. Screamed about how Emily had manipulated everyone, how she was nothing but a dirty little orphan playing queen. It was live-streamed. Her meltdown went viral. Public sympathy flipped instantly, back to Emily. And this time it stayed, because people didn't just see her as a billionaire's wife anymore. They saw her as a survivor, someone who'd been thrown away, weaponized, lied to, and who still rose from it all like she was built for war. But Victoria wasn't finished. She made one last move, a legal attempt to reverse the adoption. Yes, you read that right. She filed a motion in court to officially void Emily's adoption, on the grounds that it was never formally filed, just arranged. If successful, Emily's legal identity would be shaken. Her name, her childhood records, her inheritance claims. It was the final insult. Erase her existence. "I want to take the stand," Emily told Elias. "You don't need to, our lawyers—" "No," she said. "This ends with me. She brought me into her house like I was dirt, and now she wants to wipe me out like I was never even there. No, this time I speak." Courtroom packed, cameras everywhere, journalists behind glass, Victoria sitting stiff, emotionless. Emily stood before the judge and said one thing that no one expected. "I agree." Gasps. Judge leaned forward. "You what?" I agree, Emily repeated. I was never a Bennett. I was a placeholder in their family photo. I was a debt they tried to bury. I have no interest in carrying their name. She looked over at Victoria. But they don't get to take my story, my pain, my strength. That's mine. She pulled out a document. A name change petition, Emily Ward, legally, permanently, fully. Victoria didn't speak, couldn't. She had lost everything, and now she couldn't even claim the girl she once owned like furniture. The judge approved it on the spot. Outside the courthouse, Emily stepped into a sea of flashing cameras. A reporter shouted, "What would you say to the family who tried to erase you?" Emily paused. Then she said calmly, "Thank you for making me everything you were too afraid to be." And with that, she walked away, a ghost in their past, a storm in her future. It had been 6 months since the courtroom, 6 months since the name Bennett was cut from her life like a rotting limb. And in that time, Emily didn't just recover, she rose. The Ward Foundation tripled its projects: new housing for foster youth, legal aid for adopted children in abusive homes, scholarships for kids who grew up forgotten, all in her name. People stopped calling her Elias Ward's wife. They called her Emily Ward, and in some rooms, just Emily, because she didn't need a last name anymore. She was one of those people, iconic, singular. But behind the cameras, the speeches, the fundraising galas, there was still a girl who had once cried on a dusty balcony, forced into a marriage she never asked for. Except that marriage, it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her. Elias watched her now from the corner of the balcony, a glass of dark wine in his hand. She stood barefoot, in a silk robe, hair down, city lights dancing in her eyes. "You know," he said, voice low, "the world's still wondering if we did all this for revenge." She smiled. "Let them. You never released the files on your adoptive father, the ones that could have put him away for life." She nodded. "I know." "Why?" Emily looked up at the stars. "Because prison would make him a martyr. Silence, that makes him irrelevant." Elias grinned. "You're terrifying sometimes." She looked over her shoulder. "That's what happens when you raise a child like a ghost. She comes back as something stronger." He walked to her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "You ever regret it?" she whispered. "Choosing me?" He shook his head. "I didn't choose you, Emily. I saw you, and I stood still long enough for you to choose me." She leaned into his chest, the rise and fall of his breath grounding her. "You were the first person who saw me," she said softly. "Not the burden, not the pity project, just me." He kissed the top of her head, and what I saw was a storm in disguise. Later that week, she sat down for a one-on-one interview, exclusive, global. The final question came at the end. "If you could go back," the interviewer asked, "to that girl sitting alone in the Bennett mansion, what would you tell her?" Emily didn't even pause. "I'd tell her, they don't love you, but that's not your fault. And someday you'll build something so powerful that they'll wish they had." "And do you forgive them now?" She smiled. "No. But I've moved beyond them, that's enough." In a quiet neighborhood far away, Victoria Bennett sat alone on a porch swing, watching her garden die. She turned off the TV when Emily's interview aired. Couldn't bear it. She had once tried to erase a girl she didn't understand. Now the world had replaced her with that same girl. And Charles, silent, bitter, forgotten. Even Clarissa moved away, disgraced. Her name a punchline on social media. She blamed Emily for everything. But Emily never said her name again. She had no reason to. The past was ashes now. And Emily Ward, she was fire.